The summer she turned 11, Winnie Kessler started hauling home the hay that nobody else would touch. They were the big round kind, tall as a yearling calf and twice as wide, and every last one had gone bad. Rain had caught the neighbors' cutting before the tarps went on. The wet had crept into the cores and turned them dark and sour, the sweet green smell gone over to something like a damp cellar. No animal in the county would put its nose to them now, so the men rolled the spoiled rounds off to the ditch banks and the fence corners to rot. They were glad to be shut of the weight, and never gave them another thought. Winnie gave them a great deal of thought. With a length of frayed rope over her shoulder, she went from place to place, asking in her small, even voice whether she might take the ruined bales off their hands. The men said yes before she had finished the question. It cleared the eyesores from their land for nothing. What none of them could work out was why a slip of a girl would want a whole summer of feed no beast would eat, or why she kept coming back for one more. "You building a fort out of them, honey?" Cyrus Tate called from his porch the first afternoon he watched her wrestle one up the lane. Two of the men leaning on his truck laughed along with him. Winnie only raised a hand to show she had heard, set her shoulder back into the rope, and kept pulling. The Kessler place sat on the meanest corner of the county. It was the dry western lip, where the ground tipped up toward open sky and nothing stood between the fields and the far horizon. Out there the wind never truly rested. It came off the flatland in long, steady rivers of air, and every spring it did the same quiet robbery. It lifted the finest, darkest crumbs of the topsoil, the light, rich part that held the moisture and the life. It carried that away over the fence and left the fields a shade paler, a touch harder, a little poorer than the year before. That was the cruel arithmetic of the place. The wind never took the heavy sand or the stones. It took only the best of the ground, the fine milled dust a plant needs to grow. And it took that first, and took it every year. Her father, Harlan, watched it happen and could not stop it. Each planting he turned under a thinner skin of good earth. Each harvest the yield slipped again, and the figures in the ledger by the kitchen lamp grew harder to look at. "We are farming the wind more than the ground," he said once, low, not meaning for her to hear it. She heard. She carried the sentence around inside her for a week, like a splinter she could not reach. The answer, when it came from her grandfather. Old Silas had farmed the same dry lip through the dirty 30s, when the sky itself had turned to grit and whole farms had simply blown away to nowhere. He kept a cracked county pamphlet folded into his Bible, its cover soft as cloth from years of handling. One still evening he spread it on the porch boards and set a knotted finger on a drawing of a long, low hedge standing against a field. He told her how the country had near been lost to the wind. He described a ground gone so bare and so dry that the storms peeled it off and hauled it clear to the next state. He told of a noon sky turned black as midnight, of mothers hanging wet sheets over the cradles to strain the dust from the air. And he explained that the government had at last sent crews to plant belts of trees across the open plain. Thousands upon thousands of miles of them, he said, set down not for shade and not for lumber, but to break the moving air before it could ever reach the dirt. A living wall, they called it, he said, and moved his finger along the little hedge on the page. Slow the wind down at the ground, and it drops whatever it is carrying, and it quits digging up more. Winnie looked from the drawing to the bare fence line, and something in her settled into place. She had no trees. Trees wanted years she did not have, and rain the farm could not spare, but she had a whole county of ruined bales rolling to nothing in the ditches, dense as brick and taller than she stood, and she had one entire summer with nothing she would rather spend it on. So she began, and the beginning was pure misery. A wet round bale can outweigh a grown man 3 or 4 times over, far past any child's lifting, so she did it the slow old way instead. She backed the family's patient old mule up to each bale with a low wooden sled her grandfather called a stone boat. With a fence rail for a lever and 2 planks for a ramp, she pried and rocked the dead weight up onto the boards a finger's width at a time. Then she walked the mule the whole long haul up the lane and out to the bare western edge. The first bale alone took her most of a morning. Her palms tore and scabbed and tore open again, until Ma bound them in strips of an old bedsheet. She gave up the swimming hole and the cool shade of the porch and the whole loose freedom of a farm summer. Every single day she walked out into the white heat and levered another aboard. 1 bale, then a handful, then a dozen standing end to end along the western fence, and then 30. By the middle of July, more than 50 of the great dark drums walled up along the boundary where the wind struck hardest. The reek of them carried on the hot afternoons. Flies found them in droning clouds, and the men found her a fine source of amusement. There she goes, hoarding rot, Bram Ordway said at the feed store. Pitched to carry, Cyrus Tate had a sharper line and wore it out with use. Something about the Kessler girl running the only hay farm in the state where the hay came out the far end as manure. The laughter that followed was the easy kind, the kind that costs the laugher nothing and settles a long while on the one laughed at. Harlan bore it worse than she did. A man's pride is a tender thing among his neighbors, and every joke about his daughter's wall of garbage landed twice as hard on him. One evening he came out to the fence with his jaw set and told her, flat, that it was finished. She had made them a laughingstock, he said, and the stench alone was cause enough to put a match to the whole rotten line. Winnie stood her small ground in the failing light. Grandpa said a living wall saved this whole country once, she answered. I couldn't get trees. This was the only wall I could carry. He looked at her a long moment, and then out at the pale, scoured field beyond her, and then back at the crooked rank of bales. He did not tell her she was right, but he did not make her quit, either. The next morning a second pair of work gloves lay on the porch rail, left there without a word. Then the wind itself corrected her. A hot, dry gust front rolled through in August, only a small taste of what the season could truly do, and it laid bare the flaw in her work. She had stacked the bales tight and solid, packed shoulder to shoulder like a stone fence, because solid had felt like strength. But moving air does not lie down behind a solid wall. It vaulted clean over the tight-packed top, curled downward in a hard rolling eddy, and set to scouring a raw trench in the ground close behind the bales. She stood over that fresh wound in the dirt, with her stomach down in her boots. Silas came and looked, and only nodded, as though he had been waiting for exactly this. The mistake, he told her, was the very thing that had felt strongest. A solid fence only picked a fight with the wind. The air leapt the top and rolled down hard just behind it, and cut a trench in the very ground she had meant to shelter. The old belt crews had built theirs loose and open on purpose, he said, in staggered rows a body could see daylight through. That way the wind would climb into them and filter and lose its temper, and lay its load down gentle, far out past the barrier, 10 times as far downfield as the belt stood tall. Loose and leaky beats tall and tight, he said, every time. So she did the hard thing, and unbuilt half of what had already cost her half a summer. She dragged the bales apart into a staggered double row, one rank set behind the other, with gaps between them like a comb missing teeth, so the wind would be forced to strain through and slow rather than leap over. It ate 2 more weeks, and every hour of daylight, the men watched her tear down her own wall and rebuild it full of holes, and laughed twice as hard, certain now the girl had mislaid whatever sense she had begun with. By September, the barrier stood finished along the whole western fence, a long staggered rank of great dark cylinders, ugly and leaking and precisely as her grandfather had drawn it on the porch. And then there was nothing left to do but wait. She could only hope the season would prove her right before it proved her ruined, and try not to hear the county laughing over its fences. The dry season came to collect its debt in the last week of the month. It began as a bruise low on the western horizon, a dirty brown line where the sky met the flatland, and it grew as they watched. Winnie was in the yard when Silas stopped dead on the porch step, stared at it, and said one quiet word she had never once heard him speak in fear. The brown line swelled into a rolling black wall 1,000 feet high, boiling up over itself like water somehow turned solid, swallowing the sun as it came on. It was the very thing the pamphlet had drawn. It was the thing that had hollowed out the county once before. Inside, Harlan roared, already running for the house. "All of you, get inside, now!" They ran as the daylight went the color of a deep bruise and then of nothing at all. The first grit struck the windows like a load of buckshot. Winnie's mother pulled her back from the glass, but the girl twisted against her hold and pressed her bound hands to the pane. Out there in the last gray light stood the western fence, and she had to know. The storm hit the wall, and the wall bit back. She watched the black air pile against the leaking rank of bales and shred itself apart on them. She watched it stall and stumble and pour its brown load down along the near side of the fence in long banked drifts instead of carrying it off. Some of the wind climbed through the open gaps, just as Silas had sworn it would, whistling and gutted of its strength, and laid itself down over the field with the fine dirt it had carried in from the open ground upwind. The house shuddered on its sills. The world beyond the glass was a howling brown nothing. And Winnie stood with her heart going like a cornered rabbit and watched a wall of ruined garbage do the one thing she had carried it there to do. It went on for the better part of an hour. Then it thinned, and then it moved off east, and a strange brown daylight leaked back down over a country that had been changed while their eyes were shut. They went out into a silence broken only by the tick of settling grit. Across the neighboring fields, the exposed rises had been stripped pale. The good dark skins scoured off the high open ground and carried who knew how far, while the fence lines and the hollows lay choked with drifts. On Cyrus Tate's ground and Bram Ordway's, and the wide flats toward the river, the young wheat stood bent and half-buried, its roots bared to the wind across the worst of the open, just as the crops had come up ruined in her grandfather's day. A hard share of everyone's living had blown away in an hour, and behind Winnie's leaking wall of rot lay a long dark band the storm had not been able to strip. For a good stone's throw downwind of the bales, 10 times their height and more, the ground sat dark and anchored, where the slowed air had never gathered the speed to lift it. A thin skin of fresh drift lay caught along the fence on top of it. Farther out, past the barrier's reach, her family's ground had suffered with the rest, scoured on the rises and choked in the low spots. It was not a clean or a perfect saving. But the best strip of the Kessler place, the living ground closest to the wall, had stayed exactly where she had chosen to stand and defend it. The men came to the fence as men come when they have run clean out of jokes. Cyrus Tate stood with his cap crushed in both hands and looked a long time at the dark-held ground on her side and the dead pan on his own. He could not seem to find the front end of a sentence. "How did you know?" he said at last. It did not come out as a question. It came out as a grown man asking a child to teach him something. Winnie stood beside her grandfather, small and sunburned and certain. "I didn't leave it solid," she said. "Grandpa showed me. A tight wall just makes the wind jump and dig harder on the far side. You have to let some through, so it slows down and drops the dirt instead of stealing yours." She nodded out toward the dark-held band along her fence. Some of that top drift blew in on the storm, but underneath it, our own dark ground is still here. The wind slowed before it could ever lift it. Cyrus Tate looked from the deadpan at his boots to the dark drifts banked on her side. "We rolled it into the ditch," he said. "Quiet, and you went and carried every piece of it home." Bram Ordway crouched and ran a fistful of his own dead hardpan through his fingers and let the last of it fall away. All summer, he said, mostly to himself, they had watched her cart their cast-off rot up the lane and laughed. And that same rot had stood between her family's soil and the wind, while their own bare rises went up into the sky. Harlan Kessler set a hand on his daughter's shoulder, and this time he set it out where all of them could hear. She had told him a living wall once saved this country, he said, and he had very near made her stop. Silas said nothing at all. He only drew his soft, cracked pamphlet from his shirt pocket and held it out over the fence to Cyrus Tate. He turned the old drawing of the long, low hedge up to the brown light so the men could read for themselves the thing a girl had built out of what they had all thrown away. By the following spring, the western fence lines of half the county wore barriers of their own. Some hauled home ruined bales as she had done. Some at last planted the belts of trees the crews had begged them to plant 2 generations back, loose staggered rows meant to leak and slow the wind rather than stand solid against it. Cyrus Tate sat in a double row of saplings along his worst edge. When a neighbor asked him why, he said only that the Kessler girl had schooled him, and let the matter rest there. The great dark bales rotted down over the seasons, as rot always will, but they did their last work even as they crumbled, softening into a long, low ridge of black earth that Winnie's field drank up like a promise finally kept. Where the ugliest wall in the county had stood, the richest strip of ground on the whole place came up green each year after, feeding on the very soil the storm had tried its best to carry off. She had not only stopped her family's losses. Between the soil the wall had held and the black crumbling earth the old bales left behind, that sheltered strip grew richer season by season, into a run of harvests the dry lip had never once given her father. And Winnie kept hauling. Long after she was grown, folks passing the dry western lip would still catch sight of her out along the boundary in the low evening light. She would be rolling one more spoiled bale into a gap, patient and unhurried, mending the living wall a hand's width at a time, as her grandfather had taught her, and as the wind itself had proved. The men had laughed because a barrier of rot looked like plain foolishness. It looked like a child hoarding garbage against a sky that would take whatever it pleased. What it truly was, they did not understand until after the storm, when they knelt in their own blown-out fields and looked across the fence at a summer of her blistered hands still holding the ground in place. If you have made it this far into Winnie's story, then you already know the truth the county learned too late. The wisest hand on a farm is seldom the loudest, and the wall that saves you is very often the one they are all still laughing at. So we will leave it with you, the way we always do. If your neighbors had rolled their ruin off into the ditch and dared you to want it, would you have hauled every rotten bale home across the whole long summer? Or would you have stood on your porch and laughed along with the rest of them until the sky at last turned black? Tell us where you are watching from, and tell us what you would have carried. Settle in, subscribe, and stay close here, where the quiet, patient work goes on.